different directions, and that can lead to chromosome rearrangements, things like incompatibility between the eggs and the sperm, and other physiological changes which result in the subpopulations then becoming unable to interbreed. So the result is two separate species. The classic example of this is the finches of the Galapagos, which Darwin studied, which got isolated on the different islands of the Galapagos, and so they diverged into multiple species. Here's another example closer to home. The leopard frogs of Nebraska can interbreed with the leopard frogs of Wisconsin, and the leopard frogs of Wisconsin can interbreed with the leopard frogs of New England. But the leopard frogs of Nebraska can't interbreed with the ones in New England. So if something were to happen to wipe out the ones in Wisconsin and others that might be in between, you would have two separate species. And that's how speciation can occur. Okay, deduction number 10. If all of today's species are descended from a common ancestor, as evolution says, there should be connecting forms between the major groups. Well, this was a big, Darwin was going out on a limb when he made this prediction. There were no transitional fossils known in 1859, but just a few years later, Archaeopteryx was discovered, which has dozens of skeletal characteristics of reptiles, such as a bony tail and teeth, but it also has obvious characteristics of birds, feathers and wishbone and wings, for example. And many other transitional fossils have since been discovered. Now, deduction 11, if there's a unity of life based on common descent, then this should be reflected in the structure of cells. And it is. All cells have similar features. I won't go through them in detail, but then within these similarities, there are patterns of differences which are explained by the theory of evolution, but not by creationism. Deduction number 12, unity of life based on common descent predicts common molecular processes. This too is what we find. DNA, RNA, and proteins are in all organisms, and common mechanisms of metabolism. Control mechanisms. This last part means that we can learn a lot about human cancer by studying yeast. Interestingly, the genetic code is not quite universal. It turns out there are some exceptions to the universal genetic code, and evolution can predict how the pattern of those exceptions occurs, but with creationism, they ought to be all the same, or else no similarities at all. Okay, deduction number 13. It should be possible for proteins to evolve new functions if evolution is true, and it's possible. Genes can be duplicated. This involves transposons, and the mechanism is well known. And interestingly, many of these genes become pseudogenes, which don't do anything. They just sit there because the sequences that promote the gene activity have been lost. Once a gene has been duplicated, then the two genes can evolve in separate ways, and sometimes you get new proteins with new functions. There's a lot of examples of this, but it's even becoming important industrially, as in the reference that's here at the bottom, for developing new enzymes that don't exist in nature. Okay, deduction 14. If members of a group share common ancestry, this should be reflected in their anatomy. And there's a lot of examples of this. It's very familiar. The homologous bones in vertebrate limbs is just one example. Deduction 15. Common ancestry should be reflected in embryonic development. Again, there are tremendous similarities. This is because evolution works by modifying what's already there. So since mammals descended from fish, it's not surprising that an early human embryo has gill slits and a tail, which later disappear. Interestingly, astonishing progress is made just in the last 10 years in understanding the molecular biology of embryological development. So we are now beginning to learn how new organs and body plans can evolve by modification of previously existing genetic programs. This is the cover of one of the many new textbooks in the growing field of evolutionary developmental biology. Okay, evolution predicts a unique and consistent family tree showing the relatedness of different species. This sort of thing used to be done by comparing anatomy, and the idea is that there's always nested patterns when you compare different features. But the best and most reliable and objective family trees of this type come from similarities in proteins and DNA. Suppose we compare three species, a particular gene in species X, Y, and Z. We measure genetic distance between each pair of species by counting the number of differences in the DNA sequences. For example, here, 4 differences between X and Y, 4 between X and Z, and 2 between Y and Z. And based on that, we predict a relatedness that Y and Z are more closely related. I should point out this is usually done with genes with thousands of DNA subunits, and this is shown with only 6 just for illustration. But this would predict a family tree like this. And once you have that family tree, that in turn predicts that the same pattern would be observed in all genes, not just this particular one. This is pretty surprising from the creationist point of view. Compare the shark, the dolphin, and the mouse. If these were created independently, you would expect the shark and the dolphin to be more closely related in at least some genes, but they aren't. In fact, dolphins and mouse are more closely related in all genes because they have more recent common ancestors. Here's another example of a family tree of vertebrates based on a few proteins. And here's one for the entire, all the kingdoms of life based on ribosomal RNA. Okay, another deduction, this is the last one. Sets of chromosomes in related species should differ by a small number of chromosomal rearrangements. And this is always found to be the case. In fact, you can use these kinds of similarities in the same way to create family trees. And there's another example up here on this poster board you can look at later. It doesn't matter whether you use chromosomal rearrangements to make these trees, or DNA, or protein. You always come up with the same family tree, which is exactly what evolution predicts. An important and useful consequence of this evolutionary relatedness is that we can use lower organisms as models to learn about human diseases. There are 280 genetic diseases in man for which the gene has been identified, and it has recently been found that the fruit fly has 2/3 of those genes. Now, Dr. Hovind might say this is because they have a common designer, but a nuclear power plant and a light bulb are both designed by General Electric. Do you think we can learn about 2/3 of the things that go wrong with a nuclear power plant by studying a light bulb? I somehow doubt it. In conclusion, evolution is a good scientific hypothesis because it makes many testable predictions. It suggests experiments and observations that we can do, and most importantly, it's potentially falsifiable or disprovable. This means that it makes such strong predictions that if they were not confirmed, the hypothesis would have to be rejected. And I challenge Dr. Hovind to tell us why creationism deserves consideration as a scientific hypothesis. Tell us what predictions it makes. Tell us how it could, in principle, be falsified. Tell us what observations or experiments could, even in principle, disprove it. But evolution is more than just a hypothesis. Its major predictions have been confirmed, as I've shown you examples. It has withstood people's best attempts to disprove it. It stood up to some really rough tests that could have easily disproven it if it hadn't been true. For example, suppose the world really were only 6,000 years old, like Dr. Hovind says. Then we would have determined the ages of lots of rocks, and none of them would have been more than 6,000 years ago, more than 6,000 years old, and so evolution would have been in the trash. But that's not what happened. Another example, if species were really created independently, then we might have found that dolphins had half their genes similar to sharks and the other half similar to mice. And so evolution would have been disproved, but that didn't happen. Another thing about evolution is that it explains things that no other hypotheses can, and as I mentioned, it's been extraordinarily useful in guiding productive research. This is why evolution is accepted by virtually all biologists, geologists, and biochemists, and that's why it deserves to be called a theory. A scientific theory is not just a hypothesis, it's something that's been well established. And indeed, it's not only a reasonable theory, as we are debating, it's one of the most important and the best established theories